In late April of 1976, with the winter wheat already knee-high across Calhoun County, Kansas, Raymond Holt stood at the edge of his north field and listened to Dale Purcell laugh. Dale was the kind of man who laughed with his whole chest. He laughed the way other men argued, loudly, publicly, making sure the sound carried. He was standing at the fence line between their two properties, one boot propped on the bottom rail, his John Deere cap pushed back on his head, and he was pointing at the creek. "A dam," Dale said, still laughing. "Earl Denton is going to build himself a dam." 3 other men stood with him: Carl Briggs from the co-op, Ted Mossman, who ran 400 acres to the south, and a younger man named Gale who worked for Ted and had not yet formed his own opinions about anything. They were all looking at the same thing Dale was looking at. A 67-year-old farmer named Earl Denton, standing ankle-deep in Kettle Creek, with a measuring rope in his hands and a notebook in his shirt pocket, doing math that no one else in the county thought needed doing. "You're going to dam up a creek that's run full every spring since before your daddy was born," Dale called out. "You're going to spend your summer stacking rocks so you can hold water you're going to get anyway." Earl did not answer. He wrote a number in his notebook. He moved 6 feet upstream and measured again. "He's going to flood his own pasture," Ted said. "He's going to flood his own mind is what he's going to do," Dale said, and all 4 of them laughed again, and Earl Denton heard every word of it and kept measuring. The stakes were real, and they were his alone to carry. He had 420 acres of dry land wheat and corn, a modest equipment shed, one hired hand named George, who was 62 and had worked the place for 19 years, and a note at the First Savings Bank of Calhoun that came due every November. He had no irrigation system, no backup water supply, no son to split the risk with. His only boy had gone to Wichita in 1968 and stayed. What Earl had was the land, the equipment, his savings, and a belief that something in the weather was changing. That belief, in the spring of 1976, was the funniest thing anyone in the county had heard in years. At the Kettle Creek Co-op on the first Friday of every month, where the farmers gathered to drink bad coffee and argue about seed prices, New Earl's Dam had become the standing joke of the season. Carl Briggs had started calling it the Denton Reservoir, always with a grin. Someone had taped a hand-drawn cartoon to the bulletin board, a stick figure in overalls building a wall of rocks while the sun shone overhead, and underneath it the words, "Keeping the rain out since 1976. The cartoon stayed up for 6 weeks. Earl saw it every time he came in for supplies. He bought his coffee, his seed corn, his fence staples. He never mentioned the cartoon. He never mentioned the dam. He drove his old Ford pickup home and went back to work. Now let me tell you the part that matters, the part about what Earl Denton had already seen, and why he was the only man in Calhoun County who had seen it. Earl Denton was 67 years old in the spring of 1976. He had farmed the same 420 acres since 1934, when his father Clarence handed him the deed and a list of instructions, the first of which was, "Watch the land before you work it." Clarence Denton had homesteaded this ground in 1901, buying it for $2.50 an acre from a land agent out of Topeka. He had drilled the first well, built the first barn, lost the first crop to hail, and survived 2 dry years in the 1910s by storing water in a hand-dug pond behind the machine shed. He had told Earl about those years without drama, the way a man describes weather. It was dry, we stored what we could, we made it through. The lesson was not spoken, it was demonstrated. Earl had watched Clarence read the land the way other men read newspapers. The old man would walk the creek bank in February and tell you whether June would be wet or dry. He read the bark on the cottonwoods. He watched which direction the meadowlarks nested. He kept a notebook going back to 1903, rainfall by month. First frost, last frost, creek level at the gauge stake he had driven into the bank below the big sycamore. When Clarence died in 1959, he left Earl the farm, the equipment, the deed, and 47 years of weather notebooks. Earl had kept the notebooks going. He had also kept adding to them. By 1976, he had 73 years of continuous weather records for this specific piece of ground. And what those records told him, when he read them carefully and laid them side by side, was something that no almanac and no extension office bulletin had yet said plainly. The wet cycles were shortening. The dry years were arriving closer together. What used to be one drought decade in 5 was becoming 1 in 3. The creek ran lower every spring than it had the spring before, not dramatically. Not in a way anyone else would notice unless they were looking at 73 years of gauge readings. But Earl was looking at 73 years of gauge readings, and what he saw scared him enough to spend his summer stacking rocks. The dam he was planning was not a grand engineering project. It was a stone and clay diversion structure, 40 feet wide and 4 feet high at its tallest point, built at a natural narrowing in Kettle Creek, where the limestone shelved out on both banks and gave him a solid foundation. The upstream pool would hold, by his calculation, and somewhere between 8 and 12 acre-feet of water, enough to gravity feed a simple irrigation ditch to his 2 lowest fields, totaling 80 acres of corn ground. It would not save his whole farm in a drought. It would save enough of it. He began building in the second week of May, after the wheat was in the ground and before the corn needed cultivation. George helped him move stone. They hauled limestone slabs from the creek bank and the old quarry on the east fence line, loading them into the flatbed by hand and by bar. 2 old men doing the work that a younger crew would have used a loader for. They mixed clay from the creek bottom with water and packed it into the gaps between the stones. They worked 6 days a week for 11 weeks. By late July, the structure was complete, 40 feet wide, solid limestone face, and clay-packed core, with a simple wooden spillway on the north end to handle the spring flood years. The pool behind it was already filling from the summer rains. Dale Purcell drove by twice while they were building and stopped both times. The first time he shook his head and drove on. The second time he rolled down his window and called out, "Earl, I'm going to send my grandkids to swim in that puddle of yours." He laughed all the way down the road. Carl Briggs at the co-op told anyone who would listen that Earl Denton had worked himself simple. Ted Mossman said the old man had finally lost the thread. At the September meeting of the Calhoun County Soil Conservation District, where Earl showed up and briefly described what he had built and why, 3 men in the room exchanged looks over his head, the way people do when they have decided to be polite instead of honest. Earl drove home, ate his supper, and wrote the completion notes for the dam in his notebook. Pool depth at spillway, 6 feet, 2 inches. Estimated storage, 9.4 acre-feet. Gravity head to field intake, 14 feet. Flow rate to ditch, adequate for 80 acres, slow cycle. Then he went to bed, because the corn needed combining in the morning. The summer of 1977 was dry, not catastrophically, not yet, but noticeably. The June rains came light and stopped early. July brought 3 weeks without a drop. August was the same. The wheat farmers in the county got by on what subsoil moisture they had. The corn farmers irrigated from their wells, those who had them, or watched their yields drop. Earl's 80 acres of bottom-ground corn, fed by the slow-gravity ditch from his stone pool, finished the season at 112 bushels an acre. His dry-ground corn, the 300 acres that had no access to the pool, came in at 61 bushels. Respectable but not good. His neighbors averaged 53 bushels across the board. Nobody said anything about the dam yet. Dry years happened. One dry summer was not a drought. The summer of 1978 was worse. It began wrong. The April rains never materialized. The creek ran at half its normal spring level. Farmers across Calhoun County watched the sky through May and got nothing. June brought 2 small rains, barely enough to settle the dust. By the 4th of July, the county extension agent had driven out to 3 different farms to look at stressed corn and gone back to his office to write a letter to the state agricultural office using the word drought for the first time. Dale Purcell's well dropped 6 feet in June. He put in a deeper pump in July, which cost him $1,100 and bought him some time, but not confidence. Ted Mossman's corn was showing tip dieback by the first week of August. Carl Briggs had stopped smiling about the Denton Reservoir. Nobody was making jokes at the co-op anymore. The conversations were shorter, quieter, and they had the particular flatness that farm people get when they are running numbers in their heads and the numbers are not working out. Earl's 80 acres of bottom ground corn, fed by the pool, went into August with good color. The pool had dropped 2 feet from its high water mark. It was giving up water steadily through the ditch, but it had 9.4 acre-feet to give, and it was only halfway through its supply. George walked the ditch every morning to check for blockages and keep the flow moving. Earl walked behind him and checked the corn, row by row, stalk by stalk, the way his father had taught him, running his hands along the leaves, checking the ear set, reading what the plant was saying. By the 3rd week of August, Dale Purcell's corn was done. Not injured, done. The leaves had rolled to pencil width, the silks had dried before pollination was complete, the ears were chaff. He would combine what was there and call it 60% of a crop if he was lucky. He drove past Earl's place on a Sunday afternoon and saw the bottom ground corn standing straight and dark green in the August heat, and he sat in his truck at the end of the lane for a long time before driving on. He did not stop. Not yet. He was not ready to stop yet. The 1978 harvest came in, and the county average for corn was 47 bushels. Earl's dry ground corn hit 58. His bottom ground corn, the 80 acres fed by the stone pool, came in at 106 bushels. He did not say anything at the co-op about it. He sold his corn, paid his note at First Savings, and wrote the season's numbers in his notebook. Pool level at end of season, 1.8 acre-feet remaining. Refill expected from fall rains and spring runoff. Full. Damage to bottom ground corn from drought. None. Damage to county average corn from drought. Severe. Note for future seasons. Pool adequate for 1 full drought year. Would not sustain 2nd consecutive drought year without supplemental runoff. Monitor spring 1979 carefully. He was already thinking about the next one. The spring of 1979 brought decent rains, and the pool refilled fully by April. The county breathed. People at the co-op started talking about expansion again, about new equipment, about the good prices corn was fetching. The hard year of 1978 settled into memory the way hard years do in farm country, acknowledged, filed away, not discussed more than necessary. Earl used the winter of 1978 and the early spring of 1979 to extend his irrigation ditch. He added another 40 acres of corn ground to the system, running a secondary channel along the east fence line with hand-dug gradients and wooden check gates he built himself from oak planks. The extension cost him $60 in lumber and 2 months of evenings. He also dug a secondary settling pond behind the barn, small but connected to the creek ditch by a clay-lined channel, giving him a secondary reserve he could draw from if the main pool ran low. Nobody noticed. Or if they noticed, nobody thought it worth commenting on. The dam itself had lost its entertainment value once it became clear that it actually worked. The co-op cartoon had come down years ago. What remained was a quiet, persistent assumption among the farmers of Calhoun County that Earl Denton had gotten lucky in 1978, that the rain had not been quite bad enough to test his system seriously, that his results reflected his ground more than his planning, that the dam was interesting but probably not replicable and probably not necessary. That assumption held for 3 more ordinary years. In the spring of 1982, the weather changed in a way that could not be explained as a dry year or a tough season or a temporary variation. It changed the way a door closes, finally and completely. The winter of 1981 to 1982 brought almost no snow. The subsoil going into spring was already short on moisture. The April rains were light and stopped by the 20th of the month. May brought 3 rains, all of them under a quarter inch. June was dry from start to finish. The creek dropped to the lowest level Earl had recorded since 1936. He checked his gauge stake below the sycamore every morning, and what he saw matched what his father's notebooks described in the worst years of the Dust Bowl era. He went to the co-op on the first Friday in June and stood at the counter while Carl Briggs filled his seed order, and he said quietly that the county ought to be thinking about water. Carl said they'd been dry before. Earl paid for his seed and drove home. By July, the situation was past argument. The wells were dropping across the county. Dale Purcell's deeper pump was straining. Ted Mossman had lost his first corn planting entirely and replanted in June at reduced population, a desperate measure that admitted how bad things already were. 3 farmers south of the county road had applied to the state for emergency operating loans. The extension agent had stopped calling it a drought and started calling it a crisis. Earl's pool was full. The spring runoff had come in February and March, and he had captured it fully. The stone dam holding its level, the spillway managing the excess cleanly, the pool sitting at 9.4 acre-feet when June arrived. His 120 acres of irrigated corn ground, the original 80 plus the 40 he had added in 1979, went into the dry summer with adequate water. George checked the ditch twice a day now. Earl monitored the pool level against his drawdown calculations. He had done the math. The pool could sustain full irrigation on 120 acres through a 10-week dry period. If the drought ran longer than 10 weeks, he would reduce flow, cut to the most productive ground, and stretch the supply. The drought ran 14 weeks. In the 8th week, Earl reduced his ditch flow by 30% and pulled the check gate on his lowest producing 20 acres, letting that ground go. He concentrated his remaining water on the best 100 acres. It was a hard decision and a simple one. The math was the math. His neighbors had no such decision to make because they had no such resource to manage. By the end of July, Dale Purcell's corn was gone for the second time in 5 years. This time there was no expression on his face when he drove past Earl's place and saw the green. He just drove slowly and looked. The second week of August, he stopped. He pulled his truck to the end of Earl's lane and sat there until Earl came out from the equipment shed and walked to the fence. Dale took off his cap and held it in both hands. He was 63 years old and had farmed this county his whole life, and he had never in that time asked a neighbor for water. He did it now in a voice that was almost steady. "Earl," he said, "I've got 30 acres of first-year corn that might still make something if it gets water in the next 2 weeks. Everything else is gone. I'm not asking for charity. I'll pay you whatever the water's worth." Earl looked at the creek. He looked at his pool gauge, which he had posted on a fence post at the field edge where he could read it from the lane. He thought about his drawdown calculations and his remaining supply and the weather forecast he had heard on the radio that morning, which was not promising. "I can give you enough for 20 acres, he said. "I can't do 30. I'll run a ditch to your fence line by Thursday." "No charge." Dale Purcell put his cap back on. He nodded once. He said thank you in a voice that had something in it besides gratitude, something harder, something that a proud man produces when he realizes, too late, that he was wrong about something important. He drove home. Earl went back to the equipment shed and spent the next 2 evenings extending his ditch to the property line. The 20 acres of Dale Purcell's corn that received the water came in at 81 bushels that fall. The other 260 acres of Dale Purcell's farm came in at nothing worth counting. Across Calhoun County, the 1982 corn harvest was the worst in 40 years. The county average was 31 bushels per acre. 12 farmers filed for emergency operating loans. 2 farms went to the bank before Christmas. Earl's irrigated ground came in at 94 bushels. His dry ground fields, the 300 acres he had no water for, came in at 38 bushels, in line with the county. But his irrigated acres carried the year. He paid his note at First Savings in November, which was more than 3 of his closest neighbors could say. At the co-op that winter, nobody made jokes. The conversations were about what had happened and what it meant, and whether anyone had any ideas about what to do if it happened again. Earl came to the first Friday meeting in December, and someone, not Dale, not Carl, but a younger farmer named Bert Hanley, who had watched the whole summer from across the road, asked Earl directly how his system worked. Earl sat down with his coffee and explained it. The stone dam, the pool capacity, the gravity ditch, on the drawdown calculations, the secondary settling pond, the check gates. He talked for 20 minutes. The room was quiet the whole time. Carl Briggs, who had taped the cartoon to the bulletin board in 1976, asked how much it had cost to build. Earl thought about it. Stone was free from the creek and the quarry. Clay was free from the creek bottom. Lumber for the spillway and the check gates had been perhaps $250 over the years. His and George's labor was not counted because they would have been working anyway, so the total material cost for the whole system was somewhere around $310. The room was quiet in a different way after that. Bert Hanley asked if Earl would be willing to walk him through his creek and talk about whether a similar structure might work there. Earl said yes. They arranged to meet the following Saturday. Before the meeting ended, 2 other farmers had asked to come along. The drought returned in 1983, not as severe as 1982, but serious. The May rains were thin. June was dry. July was the worst month anyone had seen since the previous year. By early August, the county was back in the same conversation it had been having the year before, except this time there was a difference. Dale Purcell had spent the winter digging his own ditch from the creek to his lowest corn ground. He had no dam, no pool, no storage. He could only use the creek when it was running. But in early summer, when the creek still had some flow, he had put water on 40 acres, and those 40 acres were still alive in August, while the rest of his ground burned. It was not as good as Earl's system. It was not designed as well. But it existed, and it was keeping 40 acres alive, and Dale Purcell had built it himself over the winter because he had watched Earl Denton for 6 years, and finally understood that the watching needed to stop and the building needed to start. Bert Hanley had broken ground on a small rock and clay dam of his own on his creek in March. His structure was rougher than Earl's and smaller, perhaps 4 acre-feet of storage, but it was holding water in August when the sky was empty, and his bottom-ground corn was the second greenest field in the county. The second greenest. Earl's was still the greenest. By the third week of August 1983, the word water had replaced the word rain in most farm conversations in Calhoun County. Rain was something you waited for. Water was something you either had stored or you did not. The distinction had taken people 6 years to absorb. Some had absorbed it in time, most had not. The farmers who had not were the ones who came to Earl's fence line that August. Not one at a time now, in groups. Ted Mossman came with 2 of his neighbors from the south end of the county. A man named Chet Pryor, who farmed 350 east of town and had loudly called Earl's Dam a waste of limestone at the 1979 co-op meeting, came on a Tuesday evening and stood at the gate without speaking for a moment before asking if there was anything to be done. Earl was 69 by then and moved a little slower, but thought no slower, and his records were no less precise. He looked at his pool gauge. The level was lower than he liked. He had 120 acres of irrigated ground already drawing from it. His drawdown projections said he had enough for himself through mid-September with a small margin. Not a comfortable margin, a small one. He told Chet Pryor he could spare enough for 15 acres. He told Ted Mossman he could spare enough for 10. He ran the numbers by hand at the kitchen table that evening, with George sitting across from him with a cup of coffee, and neither of them saying much that needed saying. The math was the math. What he had stored in the spring was what he had. He gave away what he could afford to give. By early September, Earl Denton's stone dam was providing water to his own 120 acres and to portions of 4 neighboring farms. 5 families in Calhoun County were making their harvest because of a structure that one of them had called pointless, one had called a joke, and 3 had simply not believed in enough to build their own. The harvest of 1983 came in, county average for corn, 38 bushels per acre. Earl's irrigated ground, 89 bushels. Bert Hanley's new dam ground, 72 bushels. Dale Purcell's creek ditch ground, 61 bushels. Every acre that had stored water or captured flow finished the season. Every acre that had depended on rain finished at less than half a normal crop. The story moved the way stories move in farm country, through the co-op, through the feed store, through the parking lot after Sunday services, through the conversations at the grain elevator during harvest. It moved without drama and without exaggeration because it required neither. The numbers were the numbers. The green fields were the green fields. The empty bins were the empty bins. In October, after harvest, Dale Purcell came to Earl's door one evening. Not to the fence, to the door. He knocked and waited, and when Earl opened it, he came inside and sat down at the kitchen table, and what he said was this: "I laughed at you in 1976. I called it pointless in front of other men, and I made sure they laughed too. I've thought about that every day this summer." Earl poured him coffee and sat across from him. He let the silence sit for a moment. "The rain doesn't care what we think," Earl said. "It comes when it comes. And the question is what you do in the years it does come so you're ready for the years it doesn't." Dale held his coffee cup in both hands. "I just wanted you to know I understood that now." Earl nodded once. He understood that the man across his table had done something genuinely difficult, not the building of the ditch, not the asking for water in August, but this, the coming to the door. "You built your ditch," Earl said. "That's what matters." Dale stayed for an hour. They talked about his plans for a proper storage structure on his creek, about the limestone outcroppings on his east bank that would give him a good foundation, about what depth and width of pool would serve his corn ground. Earl drew him a rough diagram on the back of a seed catalog and told him what he had learned about spillway sizing and clay packing technique. He lent Dale 2 pages of notes from his 1977 construction records. When Dale left, He shook Earl's hand at the door and held it a moment longer than a normal handshake. Not much, just a moment. Something passed between them that both men understood and neither needed to describe. By the following spring, 6 farmers in Calhoun County were building small storage structures on their creeks. None of them as refined as Earl's, none of them built with 73 years of weather records behind the decision. But all of them built, and all of them holding water by June, and all of them drawing quietly on what Earl Denton had demonstrated over 7 years of being laughed at and being right. The drought of 1984 came as the records said it would, lighter than 1983, heavier than 1982, unpredictable and exhausting and not interested in anyone's plans. The county extended a drought designation through August. 4 farmers who had not yet built storage structures had hard seasons. 12 farmers who had built storage structures in varying forms and qualities had adequate seasons. The word adequate in a drought year is the word that keeps the bank from calling. Earl's system performed exactly as designed. The pool refilled in March. The drawdown tracked his calculations within 3%. The irrigated corn came in at 91 bushels per acre in a drought year, while the county average was 42. He paid his note in November. He wrote his season numbers in the notebook. He noted that the pool had performed across 3 consecutive drought years, 1982, 1983, 1984, without a single failure, without a single season where it ran dry before the crop was safe. He wrote, "System validated across 3 drought sequence. Dad was right about storage, should have built bigger." He said that last part without self-pity. It was simply an engineering observation. If he had built bigger in 1976, he could have helped more neighbors in 1983. He stored the thought for whoever would work this ground after him. Earl Denton farmed his 420 acres until 1991, when he was 77 years old and his right knee had decided it was done negotiating. He handed the farm to his son David, who had come back from Wichita in 1986 after watching from a distance for a decade and deciding his father was doing something worth inheriting. David had worked the place for 5 years beside Earl before taking over the deed. He knew every check gate, every section of ditch, every measurement on the pool gauge post. On the morning of the handover, Earl took David to the dam, and they stood on the stone crest and looked at the pool. It was April, and the pool was full, as it always was in April. The spillway was running a thin sheet of overflow that caught the morning light. The creek downstream was running clear. Earl put his hand on one of the top stones. He had placed this stone himself in July of 1976, with George holding the end of the bar while he set it into the clay bed. He did not say anything about that. He said, "Check the spillway boards every March before runoff. Replace any board that sounds hollow when you knock it. The clay on the north face needs repacking every 3 years. You can tell when it starts to seep." David wrote it down in a notebook. He had his own notebooks by then. The community that had laughed in 1976 did not make a ceremony of any of this. Farm communities do not, as a rule, conduct formal ceremonies of acknowledgement. What they do is change how they talk. The farmers of Calhoun County, through the 1980s, had stopped using the phrase Denton Reservoir as a joke and started using it as a reference, as in, "I'm thinking about doing something like the Denton setup on my creek." The cartoon had been off the co-op bulletin board for years. In its place, in a small way that no one would have called significant, Earl Denton had become the person people thought of when the sky looked wrong in May. Bert Hanley, who had built his own dam in 1983 and expanded it in 1986, kept a copy of the 2 pages of Earl's 1977 construction notes in a plastic sleeve inside his shop. He had shown them to 5 other farmers over the years, and told each one where they came from. David Denton maintained the stone dam through the 1990s and into the early 2000s. He repacked the North Face clay in 1994, 1997, and 2001. He replaced 2 spillway boards in 1995 and 1 in 1999. The pool held its rated capacity. When dry years came, and they came because the records said they would come, the dam performed. When David's own son, a boy named Clarence, who had been named for the great-grandfather he never met, was old enough to walk the ditch with his father, David showed him the gauge post and the drawdown calculations and the weather notebooks going back now to 1903, and told him what they meant. Clarence asked why the dam was made of rocks instead of concrete. David said, "Because your great-grandfather had rocks, and he had time, and he understood that the creek would be here long after any machine he owned, so he built something that would be here, too." Clarence nodded the way children nod when they are not fully sure they understand but know the thing is serious. He would understand it more completely in 2002 when another drought settled across the county, and the dam sat full and the irrigated ground stayed green, and a neighbor's son, the son of Dale Purcell, who had died in 1998, came to the fence line and asked for water, just as his father had 20 years before. David Denton gave him enough for 15 acres. No charge. The dam Earl Denton built across Kettle Creek in the summer of 1976 still stands. The limestone face is green with moss in the wet months and gray in the dry ones. The pool behind it fills every spring and gives what it was asked to give every summer. The gauge post is still in the same spot, third post east of the sycamore, and the numbers on it have been repainted 3 times, but the post itself is the one Earl drove in 1976. The stone on the north crest that he set with George holding the bar is still there, still in its original position, not moved by flood or freeze or time. The notebooks go back to 1903. Someone is still writing in them. When the land gets dry and the sky stays empty and the conversations at the feed store get quiet in the way that means people are running numbers that aren't working out, the old farmers in Calhoun County tell their sons and grandsons about the man who read 70 years of weather records and understood what they said and built a wall of creek stone for $300 and was laughed at for 6 years and was right for 50. Some knowledge doesn't get louder when the world doubts it. It just waits.